because we have 70 people coming in. No, we had to. We have 70 people. I want you to be here in one of these seats. You're going to speak second. I need a pen. And I thought I had one, but I don't. Oh, I do. I need to make a quick note to myself.
Second as a panelist or after you? Which way are you doing it?
I'll tell you in 1 second. So the way it's going to work. Oh, sorry. The way it's going to work is I'm going to speak first. You're going to go second. Paula's going to go third, and then Robert. It's in the order in which it appears. So you will be after me. You'll be the
Now,
next.
are you contemplating questions and answers?
Yes,
or
at the end.
At the end?
Only at the end.
At the end, you think you see the format as what? Us responding?
Well, so what I'll do
questions,
is, Arthur, are you gonna go around with the mic? You have to do stuff there. Is there any? Okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We can probably work that out. There's a lovely woman, Fiza, who volunteered to be of assistance. One possibility is asking her to do the walk to the microphone, but I didn't conscript her to do that. I sense if I had conscripted her, she would happily have served. So let me see if I see her. I'm not going to walk around.
Okay.
Because I can't. No, because this is gonna be simulcast. I think I need to stay put. So I ordinarily do walk around when I teach, as you probably anticipate. But I think in this case I can't. I think I need to stay put. Yeah. So I'm gonna stay put, which is sort of against my DNA. 13, 14 years. That's my goal. You know, we are also being simulcast not only to Paula, but we have prospective students who have, we have a YouTube link, and people have been able to actually link in and watch this live,
That's terrific.
which Kat set up.
Wow, that's
So it's
great.
really nice.
Wonderful.
And I figure I'll give until about 4:05. Because Robert's not here. But we're going to do it in the order of in the brochure. So you're second.
Great.
Or you're third.
I wanted to link up to.
What's that?
I just wanted to link up to Larry, so that's good.
Yeah. So I think that should work out very nicely. Because they don't really care what you say, someone's in school. Right, I mean, there's a signal one wants to convey these things.
Yes.
One more minute. It's okay. I think that's a good thing.
Oh, it's an interesting.
Yeah, yeah. But he's been here every year. Yeah, he's been here every year. Okay, I think we're gonna go. No, let me just check. I will actually start officially 4:05. It is 4:05. We're gonna go.
While you're talking, I may sit in your chair to see your power.
Yeah, you might be better situated that way. Good afternoon. Welcome. So welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have everybody here. Dean Donald Tobin expresses his personal regrets that he couldn't join us for today's program, and he also asked me to send his special warm regards to every one of you and to welcome you to the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. We're delighted to have all of you here. I want to give my special thanks to Andrea Gruhl, who each year works tirelessly on behalf of the Maryland League of Women Voters to facilitate this event and to ensure that we have a great program. I always know that the new academic year is starting when I receive Andrea's enthusiastic email message reminding this professor of constitutional law about Constitution Day. I also want to acknowledge all of our co-sponsors. They're listed on your brochure. Hopefully you have one, but I'll read them off so as not to leave anybody out. We have the League of Women Voters of Maryland, and that includes the president, Barbara Schnackenberg, who is here. It's delightful to have you. We also have, as our co-sponsors, the University of Maryland, Baltimore. This university, the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law, where you all are, University of Maryland College Park, University of Maryland College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, in the University of Maryland MLaw programs. I also want to especially acknowledge from College Park the many students in the room in the Justice and Legal Thought and Law and Social Science minor, namely the MLaw program. It's really delightful to have you all here, and it's also just wonderful to have college students who are interested in thinking about law, thinking about the Constitution. It's never too early to do that, and I will simply say, as someone who is now, shockingly to me, in my 25th year teaching law, that law is just an absolutely wonderful profession to pursue such a broad range of goals through which you can have not only a personally rewarding life, but also a life in which you feel that you're doing something important and doing it well. So I commend you all for having an early interest in thinking about the relationship between your studies and law. And I know that we'll have a chance afterwards to have some conversation when this program is officially ended and we go out to the atrium. This program is in its 10th year, and it's emerged as an important fall marker here at the law school. The program has generally focused on a group of notable and recent Supreme Court cases based on a connecting theme that's designed to pique the interest both of the League Women and the University of Maryland College Park undergraduates. I'm delighted to have both groups here, along with some of our own students and several members of our faculty. I also want to mention this is being simulcast to an audience in College Park, and we also have a YouTube channel. So we have some prospective law students who are dialing in and actually watching this in real time, and that's just wonderful. I want to especially welcome Maryland Delegate Will Smith and Maryland Delegate Eric Ebersol. Welcome. This year I decided to take a somewhat different approach to the program. It seemed to me that focusing on a handful of Supreme Court cases, or perhaps asking if 8 really is enough, risked ignoring the proverbial elephant, maybe even the proverbial donkey, in our beautiful ceremonial moot court room. We're in the midst of a presidential election unlike any other in recent history, and this is, after all, the League of Women Voters. Depending on one's view, this election promises or threatens to redefine the political landscape in ways that might affect us for years or decades, perhaps, to come, or at least to start a process in that direction. First, let me introduce our panelists. Joining me are three of my wonderful colleagues. I have Larry Gibson immediately to my right. He's a professor of law. He's a nationally recognized expert on elections and election law. He is also a notable, now double biographer of Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall. To my left, I have Paula Monopoli, professor of law here at the law school, a leading scholar on inheritance law, and the founding director of the law school's program, Women Leadership in the Law. She's also written specifically on gender and constitutional design in the Yale Law Journal. And then to my far right, I have Robert Koulish, who I know many of you know. I saw with great delight that he got a round of applause simply by walking into the room. I didn't, but I'm not hurt. Professor Koulish is the wearer of many impressive hats. He has a PhD in political science. He's a deeply thoughtful scholar in the field of constitutional and electoral politics. Please join me in welcoming my panelists. Ordinarily, I don't personally lead off with substantive comments, but because the nature of the topic is different, so too will be the nature of my remarks. In addition to making introductions, check, and moderating, yet to be checked, I will now offer some of my own reflections and thoughts on the topic at hand, which is election 2016 and the structural constitution. My argument proceeds in three stages. First, I'll explain that the principal framers of the Constitution were particularly concerned with what they called factions and with what we call parties, and that they set up constitutional structures specifically to avoid them or to reduce their harmful effects. Second, I'll explain why in many ways this proved to be an ultimately failed project. Despite some features of our Constitution, and precisely because of others, we have persistently had a more or less stable two-party system. Finally, I'll argue that special features of this election, the 2016 presidential election, operate in substantial tension with the resulting premises on which our electoral system, which along with other features comprise what I refer to as the structural constitution, rest. And I'll offer some of my own thoughts on the implications. Let me begin by offering a bit more insight into what I mean by the term structural constitution. Although we often think of the Constitution as protecting individual rights, constitutions also construct our politics. They do so by establishing processes through which our politics find expression. James Madison, for example, focused on this aspect in the Federalist 10, where he claimed that appropriate constitutional structures, an expansive electorate, representative rather than direct democracy, bicameralism, and each House of Congress answering as much as practicable to different electoral constituencies, would eliminate factions or at a minimum substantially reduce their harmful effects. Madison and other framers ascribed the downfall of historical democracies to factional violence, and they constructed these safeguards and others, including, for example, the presidential veto and perhaps even judicial review, with the hope of a more enduring and stable system of democratic governance. Although Madison got many things right, he seems to have gotten this one quite wrong. Even in his own lifetime, parties emerged as a persistent feature rather than a bug within our constitutional democracy. The 12th Amendment ultimately recognized this, ensuring that the president and vice president are from the same party, rather than continuing the post-election equivalent of shotgun weddings. Another important structural aspect is Article 2's direct presidential election, albeit through the filter of the Electoral College. These combined features and others are what I mean when I refer to the structural constitution. My central claim is that this election is different in kind from others in recent histories in ways that implicate the structural constitution. In the Democratic primary, the Republican primary, and now in the general election, the landscape concerning the electoral stakes looks and feels different in important ways. It oversimplifies a bit to imagine that all politics is a right-left ideological battlefield, but for fairly specific reasons, that's a very helpful and descriptive general framing. there are different ways to capture this. DeVerger's law posits that a single district plurality rule tends to produce a two-party system, whereas proportional representation with list balloting tends to produce multi-party systems. Another, perhaps more intuitive way to demonstrate this is called the median voter theorem, which provides the basis for a helpful graphical presentation, which I hope you can all see. If we assume a single-dimensional scale, liberal to your left, conservative to your right, so liberal at one end, conservative at the other, and if the voters are relatively evenly dispersed along the spectrum, the major party candidates, Democratic starting at the far left, Republican starting at the far right, will tend to converge on what is known as the median voter, here shown as 0.5. Each increment, of course, can represent a larger number of voters, and the number 5 remains what's called the point of indifference among the electorate. Of course, our politics doesn't really look like this. Our elections do not present, as Ralph Nader dubiously claimed in the 2000 election, a choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And indeed, the ideological distance between George W. Bush and Al Gore in that election was profound by any measure. To explain this, then, we need to modify the spectrum to account for the two-stage process, which includes caucuses and primaries as the first stage, followed by the general election in the second. And again, you can see the visual above. Through this system, we choose our major party nominees, and the effect is to truncate the spectrum for both the liberal or Democratic side and for the conservative or Republican side. By doing this, we can see the basis for the substantial policy distance that remains between the prevailing candidates, marked MD, median Democratic candidate, and MR, median Republican candidate, even despite some tendency toward convergence in the general election. I should note that although the degree of divergence is affected by the distribution of voters over this ideological spectrum, the general result, substantial policy divergence, remains even if we have a bell curve, clustering in the form of overlapping bell curves, or an even stronger bimodal distribution of the electorate. The combined dynamic of the median voter theorem, also reflecting DeVerger's law, is that a centrist third-party candidate in the general election, first past the post scheme, will get squeezed out, restoring in effect two dominant parties. Those on the sides have nowhere to go but to vote for the candidate closer to their ideological position, which political scientists will refer to as their ideal point. And third parties that occupy the wings are also likely to occupy insufficient policy space to prevail in a general election, although they might serve as spoilers, ironically throwing the election to the more ideologically distant major party candidate, and indeed some claim that was the effect of the Ralph Nader candidacy in the 2000 general election. Election 2016 potentially thwarts this story in profound ways. In both the primary and caucus stage and now in the general election, the challenges to the mainstream candidates were not based on ideological positioning, at least not entirely and perhaps not even dominantly. The primary cycle instead pitted outsider against insider, upset candidate against stable party statesmen or stateswomen, in both instances with the candidates assuming an ideology that provided the basis for a credible challenge. And yet, I am arguing, the ultimate challenges rested along a separate analytical dimension, one that thwarts our conventional presidential politics as it has been understood now for several decades. My thesis is hard to prove empirically, but like paleontologists, we can locate some helpful fossil evidence. The Bernie Sanders campaign was not markedly ideologically distant from Hillary Clinton's, but the tone was. Notably an outsider, not a member of the Democratic Party, Sanders fashioned himself a democratic socialist, advancing a progressive agenda with respect to the minimum wage, suggesting replacing Obamacare with a single-payer system, and more generally challenging the premises of an electoral funding system that placed him at a distinct disadvantage as compared with Hillary Clinton, his principal rival, and the ultimate victor, securing the Democratic nomination. On the Republican side, there are many things one can say about Donald Trump. But here's one thing that would be hard to say. He was notably more conservative than his principal Republican rivals. Indeed, arguably his most conservative rival Ted Cruz, along with his most centrist rival John Kasich, with Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio somewhere in between, all ultimately disavowed him in his candidacy, at least implicitly. But this was not based on ideological positioning. Rather, it was based on Trump's personal style and manner of conduct throughout the campaign. Donald Trump has attempted to capture the excitement of Sanders' supporters, and although this might seem implausible, the two primary campaigns did share in common a profound challenge to the general premises undergirding right-left politics embedded in the structural Constitution. For them, this Constitution seemed to be about something else, what we might think of as outside versus inside, or us versus them politics, represented here along the vertical rather than the horizontal axis. As I previously explained, our constitutional system, which includes direct presidential election, conduces to a stable two-party system. And yet this election demonstrates a potentially persistent and quite large minority group that favors upsetting that with either an alternative configuration of parties or perhaps with pressure to revise the system to facilitate a genuine multiplicity of parties. Indeed, that minority might be close to a majority. Consider this. As the table above demonstrates, in the Democratic and Republican primaries and caucuses, we had the following vote breakdowns. I've tallied the votes for Trump and Sanders, the outside challengers, to get just over 25 million votes cast. I've likewise tallied the votes for Clinton and the other Republicans, who I think of as the more conventional candidates, to get just over 31 million. This might actually understate the ratio of outside challenger to traditional inside candidate, for example, by excluding those who supported Ted Cruz in the Republican primary, who many viewed as a more credible outside challenger despite his long-standing senatorial career as compared with Donald Trump. But even conservatively, 44.8% of the electorate arguably based their votes in this election as an outside-inside contest rather than a more conventional right-left contest, whereas 55% roughly viewed it in more conventional ideological terms. One serious challenge is that our structural Constitution, including the institutions that we've developed around it, do not create a happy outlet for disgruntled voters forming a minority of the electorate, however large. Here, the minority is approaching half the voting population. We do not have viable smaller parties, as do, for example, parliamentary democracies. We do not run our elections based on proportional representation with the use of party lists. In that system, because votes cast translate to a percentage representation based on party strength, third-party votes are not lost, wasted, or even at odds with the ideal point of the person who casts the vote. The closest institution we have is the Electoral College, but this has become more a method of vote counting and error management than a meaningful deliberative body through which we choose our head of state. One critical difference between our voting system and a parliamentary system is that ours motivates the formation of governing coalitions at the caucus and primary stage, and thus before the general election takes place. By contrast, absent a majority winner, parliamentary systems push coalition formation to the post-election phase, and that creates the possibility that smaller parties can participate in the ultimate governing coalition that forms. This election highlights the frustration associated with the pent-up desire for third-party candidates, those who reject the major party candidates, and a system on which two parties inevitably dominate. It also highlights the lack of an effective means of translating that energy into the operative machinery of governance. Whatever one thinks of their candidacies, one thing is clear. Neither Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party nominee, nor Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee, will form part of a Clinton or Trump presidential administration. Doris Kearns Goodwin's study of Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals referred to his primary rivals, not to those he defeated in the 1860 general election. Indeed, facilitating a party-based executive team is what the 12th Amendment was all about. Although there have been notable changes since the Lincoln presidency, this feature of our structural Constitution persists to this day. To be clear, I am not predicting that in the immediate aftermath of this election we will witness a seismic constitutional change. But depending on the outcome, we might witness a major reconfiguration of at least one party. And if one party is reconfigured, then by definition, so too is the other in a two-party system. We might also witness greater pressure than in the past to ensure a minority voice in governance, although as a constitutional matter that is extremely difficult to accomplish. I do think we're witnessing something real and significant. To paraphrase Malcolm Gladwell, it's often hard to know that you're approaching a tipping point before it actually tips. Our politics no longer neatly aligns with the embedded assumptions that undergird our constitutional democracy. Those stresses won't go away no matter who wins in this presidential election. Thank you, and I'd like to introduce the first of our other panelists, Professor Larry Gibson.
Thank you, Max. I am the senior member of the faculty, having been here for 43 years. And so on behalf of the faculty, I'd like to welcome all of the guests, particularly the League of Women Voters, and the students. And as to the students, please extend my greetings to any of your parents whom I taught. I agree with my colleague Max that structural constitutions promote our existing two-party system. And I say structural constitutions because I want to emphasize that it is not just the federal constitution, because in fact it is the state constitutions and state laws that regulate most aspects of our electoral system. The United States Constitution gives congressional seats to the states, but it leaves to the states to decide how to allocate those seats into districts and how the elections will be held. For example, nothing in the United States Constitution or federal law would prevent a state or all of the states from holding runoff elections, requiring candidates for Congress to receive not just a plurality, but a majority of votes. A few states, mostly in the South, do have runoff elections in primaries: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and a few other states. I have been actively involved in national elections in 3 African countries. They all require candidates to reach a majority to be elected. They all hold runoff elections among the top 2 voting candidates in the first round, and they all have multiple political parties. Requiring the ultimate winner to obtain a majority of votes in a runoff election gives real power, as Max has suggested, and enduring relevance to smaller groups and political factions. State regulations not only regulate the election to members of Congress, but also they regulate the process of electing state and local governments. Many state procedures promote and preserve the two-party structure and frustrate efforts to grow other parties. Let me give you a few examples here in Maryland. By law, the members of the Maryland Election Board, all of them, and the members of all 24 local election boards are required by law to be Republicans or Democrats. In Maryland, in each polling place, the election judges are 1/2 Republican and 1/2 Democrats. Under Maryland law, only the 2 major parties may select their candidates by way of state-run and state-financed primary elections. I teach a course here called Election Law that, among other things, details the advantages that Maryland law gives to the governor's party, who's called under state law the majority party, and the party getting the second highest vote in the gubernatorial election, called under Maryland law the principal minority party. Now, here's where Max and I may disagree. From my vantage point, I see nothing happening now or on the horizons that signals significant movement away from this two-party structure. I do not believe that the current election cycle, the primary or the general, is creating or revealing any real strain on the prospects of that system. Once the dust from this election settles, the party structures will look much like they have looked for many years. Of course, there will be changes in people and changes on some substantive issues. Additionally, there are ongoing changes in technology, differences in the means by which campaigns conduct themselves and reach voters. But what will remain will still be the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Virtually every member of Congress will be a Democrat or a Republican. Likewise, as to the governors of the states and the state legislatures. The current presidential election has been and continues to be entertaining and with its own special features. But it is not new and does not portend, in my view, towards any fundamental change. Certainly, candidates running and succeeding by calling themselves outsiders is not new. It happens often. The very first presidential campaign in which I was heavily involved was with a candidate who ran for president as an outsider, Jimmy Carter. Carter's career before running for president included only 4 years as a fairly indistinguished state senator and 1 term as the governor of Georgia. He was mainly a businessman and a peanut farmer. Carter, when he began his campaign, had no real organization and certainly no national recognition and no standing in the polls. He was facing, and isn't this interesting, 16 Democratic candidates, many of whom were much more well-known, including Indiana Senator Birch Bayh, Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris, Idaho Senator Frank Church, Arizona Senator Mo Udall, former Ambassador Sargent Shriver, California Governor Jerry Brown, and of course, former Alabama Governor Wallace. When Carter came to Baltimore the first time during his campaign, there were no elected officials there to greet him or to introduce him. It was so bad that they asked me to introduce Jimmy Carter in his first public rally in Maryland as a candidate for president in 1976, which I did from a platform on Lexington Street in that shopping area between Howard Street and Park Avenue. I didn't do it because I knew Jimmy Carter or knew much about him. I did it as an accommodation to a friend of mine, attorney A. Dwight Pettit, who he knew Jimmy Carter and had invited him to town. Jimmy Carter's slogan was, "Leaders for Change." He was an outside candidate. Winning as an outsider is not always the hardest thing to do, especially if there are multiple so-called establishment candidates and only one main outsider. In a multi-candidate race, sometimes the best spot to be in is to be the single outsider in a larger field of more well-known candidates. Donald Trump's recent success in the Republican primaries against a large field of establishment candidates was largely a function of arithmetic, particularly division. I suspect, here where I may have another disagreement a little with my colleague, that combining for analysis purposes, the Sanders primary voters and the Trump primary voters, as tempting as it may be, may lead one to give too much significance to this outsider-insider notion. The Sanders votes and the Trump votes did not grow out of the same phenomenon. The political press has often oversimplified reality by saying that the Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign both appealed to angry voters who were disenchanted with the major political parties. In my view, the success of those two campaigns had not much in common, and often, they had more in discommon. What they really had in common is they happened about at the same time, and not much more than that did they have in common. First, the Sanders voters. The Sanders campaign was about left, right, conservative, liberal ideology. The Sanders voters, many of whom are personal friends of mine and have been political allies for many years, were liberals who now call themselves progressives, who believed that the Democratic Party had moved too close to the center and was too far away from the liberal agenda. They believed that this shift began with President Bill Clinton, that there was not sufficient dramatic and substantial shift back to the left under President Obama, and that Hillary Clinton would likely continue and perhaps accelerate the Democratic Party's movement to the center. The Sanders people were concerned that Hillary Clinton was just not progressive enough and was not likely to give sufficient priority to the progressive agenda. This is a substantive concern. I guess you could say that they were angry, but I would be likely to describe is that they were anxious about moving more aggressively on issues they considered important. That's the Sanders voters. Quite different were the Trump voters, and a very different phenomenon. Many of them were and are angry, and not principally about substantive issues. They're angry about some party politics. Trump voters became angry at their team, their party leadership team, who lost the presidency 8 years ago to Barack Obama. The initial reaction to that anger was the emergence of the Tea Party. That anger reached a boiling point when Obama and the Democrats were reelected 4 years later. And that anger is directed at party leaders, the Republican establishment. How could they let that happen again? There is some ideology and substantive issues involved, but the dominant reaction was partisan anger that their team had lost again. And that anger has led to a call to fire the coaches. Let's get someone else in who we can win again. The establishment approach is labeled as politically correct and is abandoned for a new approach. As Donald Trump says, what do you have to lose? Those were as I see, the the Sanders and Trump campaigns in the primaries. So now, what about political parties after this general election? It somewhat depends a little bit on the outcome, but I don't think dramatically much. Max seems to believe that this election suggests a shift away from the parties as left-right ideology centers to outsider dynamics. But I'm not sure I agree. I've never viewed the two major parties as essentially ideologically focused. The two major parties have been held together by a combination of geographical, demographical, and ideological considerations. The mix and the dominance of one force over the others varies from time to time. If I had to rank them in significance over time, I would give the geographical features, north, south, rural, urban, coastal Appalachia, the #1 spot. Second would be the demographic factors, such as race and age, and ideology as a glue would be the third. And I see nothing in this election that's changing that. Regardless of who wins this presidential election, the structural constitutions, federal and state, will still control. The president, the Congress, all of the governors, the state legislatures will almost all be Democrats and Republicans, with each party held together loosely by geographical, demographic, and ideological forces, much as they have for decades.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I am really delighted to be speaking to the League of Women Voters members and noting that the League, for those of you college students who aren't aware of it, came about in the very historic moment in 1920 when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and that is the right of women to vote, was enacted. So it's delightful to see you all here today. And thank you to the College Park students who are here. I have one of my triplets graduated from College Park from BSOS with a degree in government 2 years ago, and so I am particularly pleased to be talking to all of you today. So I want to shift the focus a little bit because we have the first viable female candidate of a major party in this election 2016. So I want to focus on that for a little bit. And I want to talk about why more than 85 other countries have already had women presidents and prime ministers. And Professor Gibson was a senior advisor to one of those women, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. And I want to talk about this puzzle, as I call it. What is it about our system that has led to this lag in having a female prime minister, president, head of state, head of government, right? And in that topic, I want to sort of link it up to what Max has talked about in terms of the structural constitution. And he's right that the choices that the founders make structure our politics in profound ways. And I want to sort of make the case for you today that some of those choices, 3 of them in particular, have really made the difference in terms of the lag that we see in having a female president, a female executor in our country. The first of those is the impact of the founder's choice of the 3 branches of government and the fact that we have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and eventually the doctrine of judicial review evolved so that the courts were making and drawing that elusive boundary line between the executive and the legislative branch in sometimes a more expansive way in the executive and sometimes constraining the executive. The second structural feature that I think affects and helps us to sort of understand why we've been so slow in having a woman president is the choice by the founders of the singular or unitary executive in our Constitution that combines the head of state function, the head of government function, and the commander-in-chief function. And I think that's really a very essential sort of piece of this puzzle in one singular executive, as opposed to a multi-member council, for example. And the third sort of constitutional feature that I think helps us understand the slowness in seeing a female president is the fact that in the Constitution, as Max alluded to, we have direct popular elections in this country, and that's how we select the president, filtered through the Electoral College, but still a direct presidential popular vote. And so I think it's a good time to think about how all of these things really have helped shape the fact that we haven't yet had a woman president. So in Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton, who's now become very famous on Broadway, lauded energy in the executive as an essential element in protecting the young nation from internal and external threat. And we've heard a lot in election 2016, as we did in Federalist 70, about energy in the executive. Lots of people in this election are talking about energy. So what did Hamilton mean when he talked about energy in the executive? He thought that an energetic executive was characterized by what social psychologists would call agentic attributes. And these include things like being assertive, decisive, acting with dispatch, taking action. Now, those attributes are not gender neutral. Those are attributes which research sort of show that people link with men, right, with sort of masculine norms. So research shows that voters think that men are more assertive, more ambitious, more dominant, more forceful, more independent, more self-sufficient, and more prone to act as leaders than women. And in contrast, women are perceived as affectionate, helpful, sympathetic, interpersonally sensitive, right, nurturing, and social psychologists call those communal traits. And those differ sharply from the agentic traits that voters associate with men. So women are unlikely to be associated with the sort of choice of executive that we have in our Constitution, right, which is a sort of authoritative, singular, one might say strongman sort of image, especially because it's connected with the commander-in-chief function, that sort of warrior function. Voters are far less likely to associate that sort of function with women. So power is associated with agency, and agency is associated with masculinity, and consequently an expansive executive, one that has sort of inherent plenary power, is, I think, one of the explanations for why we have a fairly firmly entrenched, what some political scientists have called monosexual democracy, meaning dominantly male in our case, democracy, especially given the power of incumbency. So if increasing the number of women in executive office is a desirable normative goal and we want to achieve that, I think we have to think about how important it is to look at those structural choices in the Constitution. The 19th Amendment promised us that the right to vote would be protected for us in every state. But what it also, a more expansive view of the 19th Amendment, is that we also have the right to hold political office, and it protects that right as well. So if you're looking at that promise, you have to really look at these attributes that are associated with gender. And these are ancient norms, right? So when we go all the way back to ancient Greece, women are associated with emotion, men are associated with reason. And reason, obviously, for those of you government students who are here, reason was associated in ancient Greece with the ability to participate in governance. Those people who were excluded from governance were deemed to be sort of not a natural fit in terms of lack of education. They were not able to reason, right? That was an essential attribute. And the framers who created our Constitution were very familiar with the Greeks and with 17th and 18th century political theorists like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And Hamilton borrowed from those ideas when he wrote, right, Federalist 70, and he was thinking about how to design this executive. He put it a terribly, sort of a hugely significant meaning in the singular executive and having one person be the executive. And that really echoed, at the time, a lot of the sort of theory about the family and how important it was for the father to be the head of the family, to have an indivisible power, to be able to act for the family in the public sphere. And Rousseau looks to Hobbes and Locke in his discourse on political economy and argues that in the family it's clear that the father ought to command. And as Hamilton is crafting and thinking about what this executive is going to be and writing about what it should be, he's making his argument for a singular, unitary executive. I think that really is reflected in there. So when he's talking about energy in the executive, either consciously, probably unconsciously, he's really thinking about an archetypically male attribute. He talks about the vigorous executive, and he talks about the vision of energy and vigor, and I would argue that he's thinking about that as sort of consistent with virility, right, and not with weakness. And as you look, there's a story about Hamilton that he was defending a female client in court, and he argues that woman is weak and requires the protection of man. So clearly that's being filtered, right? That's the filter through which he's writing Federalist 70. So that general fear of weakness and its association with the feminine presumably worked its way into his vision of an authoritarian executive, in which the sharing of power with the more feminine institution of the legislative branch, right, which is a more communal branch, a more collaborative branch, would spell disaster for the young country. So Hamilton feels the executive has got to be able to act quickly, unilaterally, without having to engage in collaboration or consultation. And those are, again, are more communal or feminine behaviors. So those kind of schemas continue. These gender schemas continue to play a role in our politics today, right? When you check with voters, they think that regardless of the level of office at stake, that they prefer male attributes. They prefer masculine traits in their political leaders. And 25% of voters still say that they would not vote for a woman for president, and 30% of those say it's because women are not fit, emotionally or otherwise, to be president. So that still those schemas have an impact on how people vote. And one political scientist has linked the decline, right, in people willing to vote for a woman for president that they saw when they were polling after 9/11, when this whole idea of security concerns came to the fore. And if that's true, and we have been in a perpetual state of war since 9/11, that doesn't bode well for a female candidate like Hillary Clinton. So, and it's just one more example in terms of these schemas at play. I don't know if you guys remember when Arnold Schwarzenegger was fighting, when he was the governor of California, the executive of California, he was fighting with the legislature, and he derided his legislative opponents as girly men. So clearly this association with weakness and femininity still sort of is adopted, right, by our politicians and by voters. So traditionally women have been viewed to lack these sort of, attributes, agentic attributes needed to govern. And these beliefs explain the catch-22 that women who run for office face. If they behave too agentically, they're violating gender norms. If they don't behave agentically enough and they engage in collaboration and consultation, they're not fit for the office. So I think that those are still going on, and that in fact, in terms of the progress of women, we've kind of leveled off. And in Maryland, we are facing, after this election, an all-male delegation, right? And to some of us, even though those candidates may be very, very well qualified, that in and of itself is of concern. It's not inevitable that women are going to continue their progress in elective office. So unless we begin to sort of think about these things, I think that we are looking at some dangerous territory. So the third attribute that Max had referenced in his original comments was the fact that we have direct popular elections in our constitutional structure. Well, when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, there was a doubling of the electorate, right? A significant structural sort of change that the country was facing. And people were generally upset about that. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case that came out of Baltimore City. 2 women dared to register to vote in Baltimore City, Lesser versus Garnett. And there's a male who objected to this, and his argument was that this doubling of the electorate was such a profound change in the underlying agreement between the states when the Constitution was ratified originally that in and of itself, the 19th Amendment was unconstitutional. Now, the court rejected that argument, but it turned out that doubling the electorate didn't have much effect on those elections subsequent to 1920. And we only began to see a change in that as recently as 1980. And that doesn't sound recently to some of you. But in terms of looking at the long trajectory, we began to see what they call the gender gap emerge there. The gender gap being the difference, the percentage difference between what women vote for a given candidate versus how much men vote for a particular given candidate, right? So you all have heard about the gender gap. The direct popular election, generally, when you look at it as a structure, if as many as 25% of people are not willing to vote for women, the direct popular election, I think, in and of itself is going to be problematic for women being elected, right? Because it's somewhat of a popularity context, and those biases tend to get filtered through that. In addition, I think it's worthy to note that in terms of thinking about women and the gender gap, we've seen some very interesting patterns in this election, right? The gender gap in this election is as big as we've ever seen it. And so to the degree that we begin to move away from direct, in terms of direct popular election, if Max is correct, and he's talking about this sort of splitting into perhaps smaller parties, becoming ascendant, we begin to look more like a parliamentary system. And of those 85 countries that I mentioned in the beginning of my comments, many of them have parliamentary systems. Direct popular election as a device, again, tends to amp up the biases in the public. Parliamentary systems where you have small parties where the leaders of those parties tend to choose who the prime minister is going to be, tend to be better vehicles for women ascending to those positions because the small group of party leaders tends to be able to sort of take out their biases. They know the person personally, and a lot of that, tends to get filtered out. So I think there's a definite connection there between the fact that we require direct popular election. So that, I think, is what explains, in part, these structural features of our Constitution explains our lag. And if I were to say to you generally, if I were to predict whether Hillary Clinton is going to be able to overcome those barriers, I would say to you that I think it's likely that she may not. Now, the only difference, in sort of predictive outcome here is that gender gap. That gender gap is enormous. It's much bigger than it has been in any other previous election. And women tend to vote for Democrats. That gender gap tends to push in favor of Democrats. So that kind of argues more in her favor in terms of predicting whether or not she'll have a likely win in that. But I think it's a really interesting election in that regard, and I know we're all waiting with bated breath, but I think that helps explain why 85 countries have already beaten us to the punch. Thank you.
Next, we have Professor Koulish.
Thank you. That's a tough series of presentations to follow. I should have gone first, Max. But fascinating and interesting. Before I start, I wish to thank Dean Stearns, the law school, the League of Women Voters, everybody that really made this event possible, has made this event possible for the last several years and has been inclusive of our students at the University of Maryland. I'd like to give another shout out to MLaw and Justice and Legal Thought and the Law and Society minor. Thank you for being here, and you get a point extra credit for doing that. So I would like to start my talk today beginning to respond to some of Max's comments. I agree in large part, I disagree in a small part. And then I would like to go on to show, kind of address whether or not this campaign is unique. I happen to believe that it is. but I believe that it is for reasons that we haven't yet touched on today, although Professor Monopoli was getting close, but I'm going to take a much different approach to this. Before I start, I just wanted to touch on something that Paula said that I strongly agree with. And it has to do with the fact that talking about hypermasculinity, masculinity within the presidential and political party favored men structurally within the Constitution. I think that works. I would disagree, or I would use this campaign to kind of question the extent to which, and I agree that the framers designed the constitutional structure in order to appeal to men who were seen as reasonable as opposed to women, and women were excluded. They were seen as too emotional, that the constitutional structure, separation of powers, federalism, and the other departments of constitutional law were seen to appeal to rational thought, and political success would follow through the ability of using rational thought, and that it would work against appeals to emotion. Here's what we have going on in this election as I see it, very quickly, and then I'll go through. I do think that we have a unique election. I agree with my students, and we talked about this last week for the most part, who said and kind of agreed my words, this is a particularly vile election campaign. This is an election campaign that people don't want to talk about. I'm finding among my students and I'm finding among colleagues that, in comparison to 2008 and 2012, we were talking about this all the time. And I was getting as much as I can, reading everything and talking about it. This year, nobody wants to talk about it. And people are going to vote. One would think that if this were an election that nobody wants to talk about, and because they don't want to talk about it, they're not interested, therefore they're not going to vote, that part of it is wrong. Okay. People are going to vote, but still, we think this is a vile campaign. And I want to talk about how I think the vileness, the disgust we feel with this in-the-gutter campaign and the narrative that has been created around it, that is the true threat to our constitutional structures. That is the true threat to the Constitution going down in years to come. I think that we're upon a dramatic change. I have no idea what it's going to look like. Okay. So let me start by briefly talking about, Max was kind of talking about the insiders versus outsiders part of the constituency, part of the election, and maybe that's a way of framing the election, and that there is a frustration out in the public, and we can feel it in the constituency, in the public, voting public, as I'm talking about, and maybe that will lead to some kind of a realignment or restructuring within the political parties. To that extent, I have to say that I agree with Professor Gibson, and I think that the two-party system, as devised and designed, at least indirectly through our constitutional structures, through the 12th Amendment, I think that it's here, and I don't see those things being put in jeopardy. I don't see a realignment being put in jeopardy by this campaign. Very, very briefly, this is why I think that. I think that we still have a very, very strong party division in this country, as we did 4 years ago and as we did 8 years ago. If anything, it's gotten stronger, but you see the blue states have gotten maybe bluer and the red states have gotten maybe redder. If there were a realignment pending or on its way, I think we would be seeing different patterns within these states. The next thing is that if there were going to be a realignment, we would see it at the level of the states and local elections. We would see changes coming, more divisions coming within the state houses, and quite frankly, by last I checked a few days ago, the campaigns at the state level and the state houses, governorships, and state legislatures are still firmly in the hands of the party elites. And as we know, too many, I just gave away my political persuasion there. Too many are in the hands of establishment Republicans. I'm a Democrat. But they're in the hands of party elites. We don't see any structural changes going on at the state level. And again, I think that if there were a party realignment underway, we would see that kind of germinating up at the local and the state level. The fourth point that I would make on this is that even though we have Bernie Sanders representing outsiders, I think his outsiders are much different than Donald Trump's outsiders. I agree with Professor Gibson on that point. When we look at some late summer primary elections in Florida, in Arizona, and in Wisconsin, what was surprising to me and to some others, political scientists, is that the establishment elite candidates won, and they won handily by landslides, okay, by high 50s in the 60s, over 70%. I'm talking about John McCain, who came out tepid support of Donald Trump. I'm talking about Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, tepid support of Donald Trump, and I'm talking about Marco Rubio in Florida, tepid support of Donald Trump. We see, despite the talk of possibly political parties exploding or imploding, we see that, looking at it in a number of different ways, that the establishment elites within the Republican Party seem still strongly in control. And if this holds, and if Hillary Clinton is elected the next president, I think the Republican Party will talk about Donald Trump as an anomaly. I think that a lot of his outsider support is more rhetorical and part of his discourse and narrative than reality. There's a lot of talk in the media about Donald Trump bringing outsiders and new people and a new base into the primary campaign, but actually the studies don't show that. A lot of his outsiders that were voting for him during the primaries, rather than them registering to vote at that time, for the most part, these were already registered voters that normally vote in the November general election. The one thing he did is he brought a substantial number of these people to vote in the primary campaign. So I question again whether or not this is an insider-outsider election. The second part is that I want to go to my students' recognition and the recognition of people working with me and my colleagues, and we're talking about, and I'm going up to my political scientist colleagues in Chincoteague Hall in College Park, and I'm saying, what do you think? How's the election going? Who's behind? What do we got? Who can we predict? And they get these looks of disgust. And these are folks that have been studying this for 30, 35 years, some of them, and they don't really want to talk about it. When I push them a little bit, who's going to win? What are the models telling you? What are the models, political scientists? What are the models? We live and breathe on models. What are the models going to tell us? And they kind of say, well, models aren't really telling us anything about this election. Nobody knows what's going to happen. We can't predict who's going to win. We don't know if Trump's going to win. We can't figure this out. We don't know what's pushing this campaign. Okay. But what we do know is that this is a particularly vile campaign, and this is what they say. There's too much fear. there's too much hatred, there's too much anger, and that anger is being generated, and perhaps that's the reason why so many people are going to vote. Okay. And they are. But beyond that, we're not sure what's going to happen. So how do we look at and how do we begin to understand the nastiness of this campaign? Well, look, this isn't, as was mentioned before, this isn't the first nasty presidential campaign we've had. We have a history of nasty presidential campaigns. Our country loves nasty presidential campaigns. These campaigns go all the way back to the beginning to 1800 with the electoral campaign between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. That was one of the nastiest presidential campaigns in history, okay? Where the Jefferson supporters, among many, many other things, and it goes to things that Paula was saying, was trying to put down John Adams by inferring his feminine qualities, that he was, quote, a hideous hermaphroditical character. All right? Can't even pronounce that. And then the Adams supporters would strike back at Thomas Jefferson and said, you know, and this is really getting close to everything that people hold near and dear. Okay, if you cherish your home and you don't want your property burned down, if you want your daughter to maintain her chastity, then don't vote for Thomas Jefferson. That's some, again, you know, a dirty campaign, any way you want to look at it. Plenty of others that followed. 1828, one of the dirtiest. John Quincy Adams against Andrew Jackson. And one of John Quincy Adams's criticisms of Andrew Jackson was that he was dictatorial, and he was accused of being possibly a dictator. Well, you know, taking what Paula said and taking what I'm going to say in a couple minutes, we could see some parallels between some of these cuts and digs at the other candidate and what's going on in the 2016 presidential campaign. So we've always had nasty, all right? We've always had antipathy in our presidential elections. More recently, there's political scientist Alan Abramowitz who recently wrote an article coming up with a notion of negative voting, and that people increasingly are voting their antipathy against the other candidate or the other political party more than they are voting who they support. And he wrote that talking about previous elections, so there's nothing new here, but that certainly helps us to begin or continue to understand what's going on, why there's such anti-Hillary vitriol going out there, and on the other side, such anti-Trump hatred and vitriol, okay? And that's one of the reasons why the two sides don't want to talk to each other. Quite frankly, I asked my students, and I raised my hand and I said, do we want to ask this question? I don't think I do. Maybe it's not appropriate for me to ask who's for who in this campaign. We've done this in the past, and then we've had debates. And the students yelled out, no, we don't want to know who's for who. We want to make friends. We don't want to know who's for who. Okay. The vitriol, the antipathy is so great, okay, that somehow that could get in the way of what's going on. Third point, then I move on. Third point is that we have here a celebrity campaign. Okay. We have two national candidates who started this campaign with near 100% name recognition. Unheard of. Jimmy Carter certainly didn't have that when he started the campaign. Maybe he had a 1, 2, or 3% name recognition, if that. Certainly almost nil outside of Georgia, as with many of the candidates that Professor Gibson was talking about. Mo Udall, who knew about Mo Udall outside of Arizona? Very few. That's the point of a political campaign, is to grow your name recognition, and you do that through the logic and the strategies of running a political campaign. So celebrity candidates, is it new? No, that's not new either. Back in 1957, political scientist William Carlton was writing about celebrity candidates from the 1956 presidential election. Who were the celebrities that he was writing about? He was writing about, referring to Dwight D. Eisenhower and Estes Kefauver. Did they run game shows? Is that why we knew who they are? No. They were national names, celebrities, if you will, because of their years of public service. Okay, Eisenhower as a general, Kefauver as running the Kefauver Committee, where his hearings on fairly new TV during the day enhanced his reputation and made them both celebrities. So there's nothing new about celebrity campaigning. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. So what is it that's unique about this campaign? Okay. And I would suggest that what's unique this year, okay, a flip in how we look at it, a flip in how constitutional structures in the Federalist Papers assume that the political system would work, is that in the past it was based upon the assumption that the voter, men back in the early days, were rational thinkers. So we could engage in dirty campaigning, we can engage in negative campaigning, but we could also appeal to the rational voter. So yes, you could criticize and condemn and insult your opponent, but the bulk of the campaign was still talking about policy issues of the day, okay, leading to deliberative discussions of policy and debates about substantive issues. In this presidential election, which I'm referring to as the reptilian election, is that what we have is a new narrative that is appealing not to reason, human reason and rationality, but it's appealing to the reptilian brain, the amygdala, okay? That part of the brain that's trying to get undereducated voters to respond on instinct, on impulse, to act quickly. And what does the amygdala take care of? It takes care of, it handles the fight or flight response that potential voters have. It's not a pleasure principle, okay? It's a hatred principle. It's appealing to our fears. It's appealing to our anger. It's appealing to our hatred. All right? And it's intended to get people to act and to respond irrationally. And that's what we see as the dominating narrative within the 2016 campaign. To finish on this is that if this is what the campaign is, and there was a French philosopher writing in the 1980s, Jean Baudrillard, who wrote a book on simulation, and using his definition of simulation, which is a pretend reality that's intended to deceive. And if we look at this campaign in terms of it being a simulated reality TV presidential campaign, what comes next but the possibility of a reality simulated presidency? And that is something that the Federalist Papers and none of our constitutional structures were prepared to deal with. Federalist 10, Federalist 47, Federalist 51, all dealt with and recognized, okay, conflict. And as Max said, sought to mitigate the deleterious effects of that conflict. But that conflict was based on rational self-interest. We are in an era where factions and parties have shifted away from appealing to rational self-interest and trying to mitigate the deleterious effects of that before it runs into tyranny, into a different type of system, okay, that I think the system of constitutional structures is not prepared to handle. And that's something perhaps we'll pursue at another time. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank all of the panelists, and I know that we could probably occupy a fair amount of time talking to each other, and I'm going to bar that in my role as moderator. I am going to disallow each of us, who I include myself, would love the chance to respond to some of the comments directed to my thesis, and I'm sure my colleagues would like to respond to the comments directed to theirs. Let me just say this. One thing I can guarantee you is that each of us have responses. And so by suspending that, it's not to suggest that we don't have them, but rather I really would like to open it up to get some questions from the folks there. And my terrific student, Linda Morris, is going to be walking around with a mic. So please, if you could bring it over here, and then she'll continue to bring it around the room to get questions. I am going to prefer students and the women from the league. I'm just going to be clear in prioritizing the questions. So please.
Hello, my name is Jocelyn Olasco. I'm one of the students, a part of Justice and Legal Thought at the University of Maryland, College Park. And my question was with regard to the POC community when it comes to voting. So I remember how last semester we had Black Student Union, Kappa Alpha Psi. Everybody was like, in the community, they were like, oh, come out and register to vote. Now it's like, we don't even want to talk about it. We're just like, it's not even a conversation of, are you going to vote? It's just non-existent. And with the Constitution, for us, it wasn't really built for us. And how do we tackle the fact that, like, if we see a decrease in voters who are from these person of color communities, how do we tackle that? Or is this election even built for people?
Do you want to go ahead, Larry?
Well, I would say to everybody, I do not believe that this election is nastier than past elections have been. I think what has happened, we all have become more sensitive. And in a sense, in my view, better people, and so we respond to things. If we look at the history of this country, there have been many elections, many times, when the appeal is to violence, it's the appeal to racism, etc. That is nothing new. And then we go out of this country and we look at what they say about each other in elections in Great Britain, or what they say about each other in elections in France. We a mob. So lighten up and get loose. Don't be so sensitive as it relates to that. I think that politics is rough and tumble. At least it's just words. I mean, that's what my involvement in African countries were. We're trying to get to this point where it was the battle was through words and not through guns. I went to Liberia because it come out of 25 years of civil war, people dying, and we were trying to just get to the point where the election was being held by people saying nasty things about each other. That was progress. So I will say to you, it may sound to your ears as rough and vile, but I can guarantee you it is not new. It's been going on for a long time. I think, frankly, in some respects, this is milder than it has been in other elections. It's just the way political discourse is. And so, yes, engage. I, for one, do not believe that that's negative or that's new or that this the words. As long as it's just words, let them flow.
Professor Monopoli wants to also add some comments.
I just wanted to say that one of the really interesting things about the election, obviously the gender gap women have swung elections now since, we began to see that gap in 1980, but certainly in the last 3 or 4 elections, it's been women who have swung the election. And one of the really interesting things about this election is that in the last election, well, 2 elections ago, 2008, certainly there was a gap in terms of age. So many of my students were supportive of President Obama, many of my female students, and many people of my generation were supportive of Hillary Clinton. So we saw that age gap. But what's fascinating about the election was that in the primary, obviously Hillary Clinton didn't get as many votes as Barack Obama. The reason was because African American women voted in large numbers for Barack Obama. So my sort of hypothesis about this election is, one, the gender gap may well swing it toward the Democrats, and that's Hillary Clinton. And if African American women get out and vote in large numbers, and their votes are now predicted to go to Clinton, that's going to make the difference. So it may well be that African American women voters swing the election in terms of turnout. So I think it's really important, even if you're not being asked to go vote, that we all, especially women, obviously I feel strongly about that, and go exercise your right to vote, because that gender gap is going to matter.
Do we have a question there? Great.
Yeah, this is related to something you just barely touched on, but that is redistricting, and certainly the Constitution or the Supreme Court has been hesitant to get very engaged in that, except through the Voting Rights Act. And but with the fact that they did send the Shapiro case back here to Maryland to a 3-judge panel, which refused to accept the motion to dismiss, do you see anything in your crystal ball that at some point, just as protecting minorities' voting rights, the political party's influence over redistricting is going to be something the Supreme Court will ever look at?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just make a couple of comments, and I'm sure Larry wants to make some comments, and maybe Robert too, and maybe you as well. The political party gerrymandering cases are a complete and utter mess. The court has struggled for a very long time, going back to a case called Viet versus Jubileer, in progressing forward since then through a handful of cases, in trying to figure out whether there's any there. And it has largely come down to the question of whether Justice Kennedy thinks there is any there. And he seems to think that resolving that is largely a function of whether there's some standard that some litigant at some point is going to articulate that allows the court to define in a meaningful way what the justiciable standard is for evaluating the viability of this kind of a claim. Many of the justices on the court have taken the view that we should simply throw this away and treat this as a non-justiciable political question, and he's sort of the last gasp of hope for allowing some possible justiciable standard in this field. But he has refused to actually say what's on his mind in terms of articulating a standard. And it's almost impossible, I think, to guess at what he has in mind. Sometimes you can anticipate where judges or justices are going. You sort of envision, when they keep the door open slightly, you can envision what they're looking at ahead. So when Justice O'Connor said, for example, in the context of affirmative action, that strict in theory is not fatal, in fact, it was pretty clear she was forecasting what she might say about affirmative action in higher education. Everybody knew what she was talking about. I have to say, having been teaching this stuff for a pretty long time, I cannot figure out what Justice Kennedy is contemplating as a viable violation of a political party gerrymandering claim that would actually work, and now this problem is all the more complicated because of the present sort of constitution of the court. So there's just a lot of uncertainty there, but I can't give any kind of definitive answer as to where this is going to go. Larry, did you want to offer any thoughts on that, or Robert? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I have a prediction that ultimately compactness will cease to be as significant as a matter of law factor in districting. I mean, of course, we have the broken wing pterodactyl of the 3rd district. I mean, if that is upheld, which I suspect it may be, then anything that's a semblance of compactness is out of the way. And that's the case that you... No, I think that case deals with the 4th district. Yeah, the 6th, the district that was the Western Maryland one that was created to, that's the political gerrymandering. But I don't know. And ones could, I mean, there are people who will argue that with the advance, I mean, that compactness and these other things were factors in a pre-electronic world, and that it just doesn't matter as much that a piece of a district here and a piece of a district there and another one still can have a sufficient kind of common interest, makes sense to make it a district. And then then the issue in that case is precisely whether just straight up political considerations are unconstitutional in districting, and I don't think the court's going to get there.
I think there's a question over here.
I can say it loudly.
All right.
No one has mentioned
I can respect a loud voice.
No one has mentioned the influence of money.
Well, I mean, I did mention it in the sense that I mentioned that one of the central focal points of the Sanders campaign was the systemic setup of a system that dramatically favored his rival and the ultimate victor. And I didn't use the word money, but that's what I was talking about.
Citizens United is behind it.
Well, I think that's fair, and that's certainly a major contributor. I mean, the data seem to significantly support that. I don't think that's I mean, that is in fact what I was alluding to, but you're right that I didn't actually say it expressly. Yeah.
I'm Gideon Epstein. I'm one of the students in JLT at College Park. Dr. Koulish, you mentioned in your talk that blue states are getting bluer and red states are just getting redder. But for instance, back in 2014, we elected a Republican here in Maryland, and that's why Barbara Mikulski says, like, Maryland's blue but not cobalt blue. Right now in 2016, we've got states like Georgia that could go blue that pretty much never have recently. And people are saying, like, 20 years from now, Texas might be blue. So do you still stand by that? And what examples do you have to counter? And really, do you think the issue of polarization goes beyond partisan lines?
Yeah, good question. You probably caught me. I probably overstated. I think in general, though, we have the polarization is very, very clear, which doesn't mean that it is unchanging. And I think we could look at an awful lot of states, including Virginia, and we see shifts of states that were red that are turning purple, and that for different reasons, mostly because of demographic shifts, will turn blue. But that's stated. If you look at, and so yes, there are blurry lines and there's overlap here. But if you Google anybody right now on a computer after you leave, look at the states where red America is and where blue America is, and that hasn't changed, and it's not likely to change. You see, huge parts of the Northwest that are going down to the south that are deep, deep red, and for the most part, that's the way it is. You look on the East Coast, then you look on the West Coast, and you see blue, and the bigger picture has been fairly stable going back over the last number of cycles, with changes as you correctly assess.
You talked briefly about third parties, and I will admit it's been ages since I've been in school, but we had a few Whig presidents, and I'm not trying to put you on this spot because I know your legal is your jurisdiction, but history-wise, can you tell us how the Whig and possibly the Know Nothing Party did get a foothold, and how they came into being, and then how they faded away?
Yeah, I mean, what we know, of course, is that the Whig Party collapsed as a result of the election of 1860, right, and the surge of the Republican Party. And the Know-Nothings kind of came in the wake of that, right? When you've got a party that essentially collapsed, there's a vacuum. The Know-Nothings tried to fill that vacuum. It didn't actually persist as a stable force. I do want to clarify one thing. When a couple of the comments seem to imply that I was suggesting that we're going to suddenly see multiple parties. I don't believe that. That's not what I'm saying. Actually, what I said was that that's a very hard thing to accomplish constitutionally, but that we would perhaps see a reconfiguration of the parties that we have, and if you have a change in the composition of one party in a two-party system, you have a change in the composition of another. If you have a sheet of paper and you divide it with a squiggly line and you change that line, it's going to change both sides of where the line is. And so I don't doubt that the elected officials are going to call themselves whatever they are, Democratic or Republican. What I'm suggesting is that the composition of those parties is apt to change depending depending upon who wins this election, I don't think we're going to see a stable third-party system unless we actually brought about a constitutional change. And I think there are very specific reasons why the United States has this kind of odd system persisting of direct presidential elections with a stable two-party system as compared with most constitutional democracies that have multi-party parliamentary-based systems. And one of them is that as the lone superpower, one thing that you really need to be able to commit to is when your government's going to end. And in a parliamentary system, that's a risk. You don't actually know. You could have a vote of no confidence. You could bring about a change. And the stability associated with having our system is one of the prices that we pay. But the composition of the parties that we have, I think, might be substantially affected. And as I say, Professor Gibson doesn't agree with me on that, and I respect his opinion. I obviously think I'm right, or I wouldn't be me. But I do think it's hard to know when you've hit a tipping point until it's tipped. And so it really is hard to prognosticate about this. But I do think that we are in the midst of a change. I don't think this is the same as elections past. And a lot of the comments, interestingly, that I'm hearing from my colleagues are, I think, consistent with what I'm suggesting. They just think that more dominantly this does align with what they've seen historically. I just personally don't. But let me turn this over to my colleagues as well. Okay, go to another question.
Hi, my name is Hannah Aiello. I'm also a JLT scholar student at College Park. I guess this is particularly in regards to the Clinton campaign, and I specifically enjoyed hearing your talk, Professor Monopoli, about her gender and how that really impacts her campaign. And I'm actually in a psychology of women class, and we just finished up talking about the gender schema theory and how that impacts our choices on how we view people and how we stereotype people. So many of you seemed very uncertain about whether, like, which candidate is going to be put into office. And I think we all know who the more politically adept candidate is. And I guess what I'm wondering is, like, when you say, like, oh, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, a lot of times the reaction that you get is, oh, you're voting for her because she's a woman. So how really, like, pervasive are these things like social biases and schemas and stereotypes in, like, can that really be the deciding factor in whether or not she's going to be put into office? Like, how serious is that, I guess, if we're looking at it from a voting perspective?
I think that it's really interesting in this election for a couple of reasons. One is, I think that the outsider status of Donald Trump, but more than outsider status, the fact that he hasn't had any elective experience at all is going to push back against some of the theories that I was talking about, right? So the notion that women don't fit the commander-in-chief function, we've got a candidate on the other side who's never held elective office. So people, I think, are less likely to say, oh, he's male, he'll be, we associate him with foreign policy and being adept at the commander-in-chief function. That's less likely to happen because he's never held elective office. So some of the schemas are going to be tamped down or mitigated in that way. And I think that the issue of the gender gap, it's not, so women have swung the elections and they tend to vote for the Democrats. Although women, in general, women voters are more issue voters than they are party voters. But I think that in this election, the gap is 21 points, which is much bigger than the historic gap of about 13 points. And so I don't know whether or not women are going to vote Democratic. I mean, I think it's more that they vote Democratic in larger numbers over the last few elections than it is that they're going to vote for a woman just because she's a woman. And I say that because your generation, right, were Sanders supporters to a large degree. So, but Hillary won the primary because of the gender gap in the sense of the fact that, again, as I said, the women in the 2008 election, the younger women were supportive of Barack Obama, and so younger women voted for him. African American voted for him in large numbers. So those women, I think, if I don't know if the millennials will come over and vote. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Well, that's a really interesting piece of this election. But certainly, if African American women voters swing from sort of Obama over to Clinton, right? If you look at that can be the tipping point. But that's why Sanders lost to her. It was because of the overall female vote, not the millennial vote. He had the millennial female vote, but he didn't have the overall vote, so.
I know Professor Gibson wants to speak, and he will in just one moment, but I also would like to give Professor Gray a chance to ask a question afterwards. So go ahead, Larry.
Let me first premise this by, so you understand my biases that may lead you to discount my prediction. But I mean, I was the state chairman of the Bill Clinton campaign in '92. And I never let him forget that we were second only to Maryland behind Arkansas in the percentage of vote for the Democratic Party. I was also a delegate to two conventions, so just so you understand my biases. But nevertheless, trying to put those aside in terms of my assessment, maybe it's because of going through so many elections. I started with the last one, and I say, now what has changed since then? So I look at the last election, which was Obama's re-election, and I ask myself, what groups of voters have changed? First, what groups of people voted for Obama because he won, who are now going to vote for Trump? I don't come up with very many groups. Are there some groups that voted for Romney who will now vote for Clinton? And Paula has suggested that there may be a slight greater shift in the gender gap. And I think that with respect to other minority groups, particularly the Latino community, that is another shift that's in Hillary's favor. And so by just sort of comparing that and say where are likely to be shifts, to me it comes down to not a close election as far as Electoral College. I know most of my friends are concerned. I am not the least bit. Unless I start seeing groups that were with one that going in a major sense to the other, I started with the last election and extrapolated to this one. So I don't think it's a close election electorally. I mean, I think Hillary wins it.
So we can go for about 5 more minutes with questions and then have the reception. So go ahead, David. Yes, we're at 20 up.
So a quick question for Larry. I was intrigued by your comments about state constitution. So I wonder, do you know, is there something special structurally about the Vermont state constitution that allowed for the emergence of a third-party candidate to major national office? And then more generally for the panel, I wonder whether the difference we might be seeing is the same sort of difference we saw in 1960, which is to say that we have the emergence of a new form of media in the form of the maturity of social media and the internet that we haven't seen before, access to social media and the internet through pocket-held devices that we didn't even have 4 years ago, and the consequent fracturing of our sources of news and information. And so I'm struck by the fact that, it may just be my ignorance, but Donald Trump nominated as his campaign chairman the leader of a major media outlet that I didn't even know existed until he was nominated. And so we have we used to get all our media from one of 3 networks, but now we all have access to media from a number of different resources, and I wonder if that has a destabilizing force on the electoral process.
I know you directed it to Larry, but let me just make one comment, which is don't forget about Minnesota in the election of Jesse Ventura. Now that was the consequence of the fact that there wasn't a runoff. So you had the possibility in a single election with a plurality rule of electing somebody who was not one of the 2 major parties. These constitutional structures actually do affect the possibility of a third-party candidate, but it was a pretty unusual circumstance, right? I'm sorry, go ahead, Larry.
Well, I won't give a long answer. There's a tradition in Vermont and Maine and kind of in New England. It's more of that, a kind of independent streak, an abhorrence to large expenditures of money for campaigns. People can lose up there because they spent too much. and that becomes a negative, so I put it more of a tradition. I don't know if anything structurally in the law that produces that, but just a tradition. People get elected to the legislature, almost sort of bragging about how little they've campaigned and how little they spent on it. But that's a little corner of the country.
I would just throw in, as per the part of your question on the media, I think clearly that new media, social media is playing a big part in the campaign, and I think it's helping to construct a new narrative, and I think that this is the first time we've had a major party candidate who has no ground game, who has very little political organization, very few people on the field doing get out the vote work, and he's relying in large part on Twitter. And this is the first time we've had that, and we see it to the extent, so far he's been extremely successful in his mastery of new social media in order to appeal, as per what I was talking about before, to people with short attention spans, the studies show with the new technologies, and with some of these more reptilian features where his tweets are very strong, they're very visceral, they're very instinctual, they're appealing to people's anger, appealing to people's hatred, and they're responding in large numbers. So there's something there.
So I think one thing we can all agree on is that my co-panelists were not driven today by their amygdala. It was in fact the gray matter, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Awesome. It's a pleasure.
And please join us for a reception outside.